I'm Andy Serwer, the moderator. This is Senator George Mitchell, Shelley Hearne. Clap for all of them. They're all great. Shelley Hearne, Ruthie Davis, and Ken Chenault. And we just decided backstage we're not going to be sad, we're going to be glad. This really is a Bowdoin dream team. And I'm thrilled to be up here with this group of people. This panel is supposed to be, you might think it's about the liberal arts and work, but it's about the liberal arts and lives and living, because for these people, their careers and work are so intertwined with their lives, they really can't be separated. It's an eclectic group, super accomplished, fascinating, inspirational to me, and it's really a collective testament to the relevancy, power, and value of a liberal arts education and a Bowdoin education. They're also super busy, all these guys, so thank you very much for coming up here and taking your time and sharing your thoughts. Senator Mitchell, I want to start with you. You have lived a lifetime of achievement, as Clayton was talking about, from the Senate to the Middle East, Northern Ireland. He didn't even talk about Major League Baseball, the Walt Disney Company. You get the call. And I'm wondering, obviously it's a case of nature and nurture with you. That part of this is your DNA. But what did you learn, and what can a liberal arts education teach that helped you do what you've done?
Well, most of what has happened in my life has been by accident.
There goes that theory.
I didn't plan or intend any of it. In fact, two trends of history are that there are many more people and there's much more mobility. And fewer human beings live fully linear lives. So I think that while training for a specific vocation can be useful and helpful, the most important thing is training people to be prepared for the unanticipated, unplanned, unintended events that will shape our lives. I feel that Bowdoin prepared me for many different things in life, because I wasn't concentrated on a specific function, a specific occupation, or a specific role. And the most important thing for me, which I don't think is relevant to most people who attend Bowdoin, I was 16 years old when I graduated from Waterville High School. Insecure, uncertain. My parents led very difficult lives, and it was accidental that I came to Bowdoin. And so what I think is most important in my life was that at Bowdoin I acquired the first faint stirrings of self-worth, of being capable of doing things that I had never experienced before. And when I left Bowdoin, I always say I completed my education in the Army. The two most formative institutions of my life were Bowdoin and the United States Army. And so I entered Bowdoin really as a boy, naive, insecure, uncertain. And I left the Army as a man with a reasonable degree of self-confidence.
It's hard to imagine you lacking in self-confidence and self-worth. But it's pretty amazing. But we grow as individuals. Ruthie, I want to turn to you and ask you, we've got accomplished business people, public servants, public health. We don't necessarily have a lot of shoe designers, it seems, that come out of Bowdoin College. What is your story? How did you get to this place?
My Instagram is @Ruthie_Davis, if you want to take a picture. I think it's, obviously it's a long story, and I don't want to give my whole story, but just going back to Bowdoin and how it got me to that, is I think at Bowdoin I really learned how to follow my passions, how to think differently, how to think how I could be innovative. It just taught me to really analyze things and kind of step back and think, how can I make this more special? How can I make it newer? And I think that's the thing that eventually got me to being a shoe designer. I actually majored in English, minored in visual arts. I did a lot of watercolors, photography, and I was big in sports at Bowdoin. And I thought I wanted to be a sports writer because I thought I'll combine my passions that way. And I first kind of went that route, which led me eventually to working at Reebok, actually to getting an MBA in marketing and entrepreneurship. And then that got me to Reebok, and that's where I learned, I kind of started to flip over from sort of the business, marketing, communications aspect to the shoe design. I realized I really liked the product. And it's interesting because when I was at Bowdoin, I recently found I used to watercolor actually shoes. And, but I have to be honest, I didn't design shoes at Bowdoin because the watercolors were, one was an LL Bean boot, one was does anyone remember the CB down jackets? It was like a green CB jacket, ski jacket, and another was like a topsider. So, but I realized that I really did like to work with my hands, and I liked the design, and that's when I started steering my career more closer to the product, always still loving the whole picture. Again, back to the liberal arts, all the disciplines. I like being an entrepreneur, the financials, the marketing, the sales, design. I've always been a designer who didn't design in a vacuum. I always designed a product with a marketing plan already in mind. I was corporate for 3 years before I launched Ruthie Davis. I always say, cut your teeth on someone else's dollar.
Right. Look at Ken over there. He's not so sure about that. Although maybe he is, it's one of your cards. He's good. Actually, he's good with it. Right. And you were always glam in school, though, right?
It's still a little bit, walking across campus yesterday, I did get quite a few looks in my shoes. So I was hoping it had evolved a bit,
right.
but yes, when I was at Bowdoin, I did push the envelope, and I definitely was a little unique in my dress, yes.
That's good.
I stood out.
I like that.
But,
Ken, I want to talk to you a little bit about what you do in your company. And, Steve Jobs wasn't the first person to do this, but he kind of really accentuated the intersection of liberal arts and technology. You remember that slide he would put up behind him, which was actually those two signposts. And when I think about American Express, which I think is number 88 on the Fortune 500, I still have that in my head memorized. That's a little inside joke. I think of American Express being sort of the ultimate intersection of technology and liberal arts because it's human behavior and money and technology. And I just want to ask you this straightforward question. How did your Bowdoin education prepare you for this job?
I think the first thing I'd say, I'd actually agree with the senator. I had no idea I was going to go into business. And if you'd asked me at Bowdoin that I was going to be CEO of a Fortune 100 company, I would have told you that is heresy. That's the last thing I want to do. I don't want to work for a large company. I don't want to work with a bunch of suits. So I think what was important for Bowdoin, and I think in a liberal arts education, and I really do believe this, is number one, I really developed here an incredible passion for learning. For learning all types of disciplines and understanding where those connections were. Second, what I got from Bowdoin, you got to remember when I was here, this was the raging 70s. So this was the Vietnam War. This was racial strife. You were faced with all types of issues. But we had a community here. And what was interesting about this community is there was clearly strife at times. And there were demonstrations. But there was also a level of communication that took place. that was very powerful. And the third thing I think that was important to me that I really learned at Bowdoin is I wanted to have a purpose in my life. I wasn't sure whether that was going to be in politics. Probably I would have leaned more towards that if you asked me when I was in college. But what I always knew, and I think Bowdoin really nurtured that, and the professors really nurtured that, and frankly my fellow students did, was I wanted to make a difference in our society. And one of the things, as you know, Andy, that I've really pushed at American Express is I really believe in what I call the convergence of the online world and the offline world. And I believe that both worlds are not only converging, but your offline experience is changing because of the digital world, the digital experience is changing because of the offline world. But was also very important, and I can't say it was absolutely Bowdoin, but I think Bowdoin influenced it, is I'm a very mission-driven person, and for the company, one of the things I've emphasized is that American Express is a service business. That's what we're in. And in fact, from my background majoring in history, I've always spent time communicating with our employees, talking about the history of American Express and how it transformed and reinvented itself over 165 years. But there were core values, and one of those most important values was we really did believe that service was a mission. Integrity and trust in our business, when you're selling financial services products, trust and reputation is everything. And so I think that this convergence of online, offline world, the convergence of understanding the importance of values. And I believe that's something that obviously I learned from my parents, obviously from people around me, but I think Bowdoin helped nurture that very much.
Right. One takeaway already, and we haven't even gotten to Shelley, for students out there maybe, is the serendipity that's involved in one's life and career, and the fact that these super accomplished people, you know, it's okay, they didn't have a plan when they were going to college, and they grew and they learned and they were open-minded and they became passionate at something, and that's what's most fulfilling. Shelley, can you talk about what you do? Because you've done a lot of different things and they're all connected.
So I've been spending a lifetime trying to build public support, passion, and political will for advancing changes in our policies in this country that are for the good of the people. It's bringing a voice to many issues that often don't have a champion. So recently passing bills on food safety protection. Was heavily involved during the financial crisis and credit card reform, which is not your typical public health issue, but being involved in trying to get antibiotics out of the industrial farming production process so that we have a little less antibiotic-resistant bacteria out there. You know, it's a lot of fun things to talk about.
Never glad.
Oh yeah, I get invited to a lot of cocktail parties to talk about these things. But no, it's not what I would have predicted when I came to Bowdoin, but a little bit different. I did come here on a mission. I very much gravitated to this school of, I wanted to be an environmental activist. I wanted to, at that time, growing up in New Jersey, cancer rates were on the rise, believed that there was an environmental component, but it wasn't enough to just talk and preach about it. You had to actually understand these issues and figure out how to help drive policy changes. And Bowdoin seems like that perfect fit. It was also very far away from New Jersey, so.
But you had, I'm going to call you out on this, but you had an eclectic experience at Bowdoin as an undergraduate.
You're scaring me.
You played in we overlap, so I know about a band that you played in. when you were here, right? Which is a little different.
Yeah.
Okay. She doesn't want to talk about it. This will have to go. This is very offline stuff here.
No. This is part of a liberal arts education.
Right.
So, it was the Crimes Against Nature.
That's the name of the band, so you can even.
It's a little anti-environmental sounding, but it really.
It was pretty out there.
They were pretty bad. In fact, the instrument that I did play, I wasn't allowed to be playing. They wanted to have a female drummer because that was different. And I told our common friend, I don't play the drums. He said, that's all right. You have confidence. You just can go out there and do it.
You should have heard these guys.
Yeah. But maybe on the confidence theme,
Right.
you know, that's kind of been a theme.
Yes. For you.
And I think it's what the senator was saying also. A lot of the work I do today is often coming into vacuums where I constantly hear that can't be done. No one's done this before. We don't know what a pathway would be to get there. And I do think, I didn't understand a liberal arts education when I first arrived here, but by the time I got through boot camp and, went through a process, we were all smart coming here, but that didn't do it. You really had to go through some amazing transformations to move from knowing to thinking. And that's been the difference of whether it's being told to be a drummer in a band, and no, I've never actually told anyone that outside of the Bowdoin campus, or a fraternity president, or sometimes playing basketball against teams that we had no right to beat, or taking a chemistry class that I had no idea what I was doing. There was still this sense of it's okay to go into the unknown, and you're going to find a pathway forward.
Right. Senator, I want to ask you, you said there's a lot of luck involved in what you did. I'm not buying that completely because...
Well, I didn't say all. I said a lot of.
Good. When did you decide that you wanted to be a politician, and when did you start to realize that you had leadership qualities?
The politics part was completely by accident. After I left the Army, I attended law school at Georgetown. I went at night because I had no money. I worked full-time during the day and went in the night school. When I finished, I applied to 15 law firms in Maine. My goal was to practice law in Maine. I got 2 responses, 2 interviews, and they both hired someone else. So I couldn't get a job with a law firm in Maine. By, again, you said serendipity, one day I opened a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice. At first I thought I was going to be prosecuted for something, but I learned from the letter that there's something called the U.S. Honors Law Program, where the Department of Justice offers jobs to people who are at the top of their class in a variety of different law schools. And I'd done well at Georgetown Law, so the Justice Department offered me a job. The only job I had offered as a lawyer. So naturally I accepted. But I still wanted to get back to Maine, couldn't figure out a way to do it, and then a couple of years later, I got a telephone call, again, out of the blue, from a man who identified himself as the administrative assistant of Senator Muskie of Maine. I never met Senator Muskie, I didn't know him, had never been involved in politics in any way except as a citizen voting, and had no interest in it. Senator Muskie offered me a position on his staff. And I thought to myself, if I go to work for him, I'll spend more time in Maine, and I'll meet lawyers, and maybe I can get a job. So I was very candid with him. I told him I'll accept and I'll do the best I can, but my only reason for accepting is that I want to do something else. He was very nice. He said, that's fine. He said, if you'll commit to staying here for 3 years through the next election, that's fine. So we shook hands, and just as I'd planned during that 3 years, I did meet lawyers, and I did get offered a job. So I came back to Maine 3 years later to practice law, but by then, I had gotten interested in politics. Senator Muskie was a truly great man, a Bates graduate, I might say, and I became interested, and shortly after I came back, I did practice law for many years here, but I became involved in politics in that way, completely by accident, thanks to Senator Muskie.
And leadership piece, did you sort of become conscious of that, or has that just come along?
That really started in the Army. I went into the Army. I spent a couple of years overseas, a very, very interesting position. Berlin, you know this new movie out, The Bridge of Spies, you've seen all the ads. It takes place, and the activities take place in Berlin. And I was part of an intelligence unit in Berlin, a combination of the CIA and the U.S. military intelligence. And to my complete surprise and shock, I was asked to become one of the leaders of one of the groups there. And so was involved in that for a while, and that gave me a little bit of self-confidence later on. And then I did pretty well in law school, and so it kind of built up, and so I felt more and more that I could handle different jobs. And I do want to say, to emphasize the point that you made to any students here. I speak at a lot of graduations. Of one thing you can be absolutely certain, and that is you are going to come upon opportunities that you cannot now possibly imagine, that you don't even think about, have never thought about. And what you have to do is to be prepared to take advantage of opportunity when it comes. And that means a willingness to risk. The greatest danger is fear of failure, intimidating people from doing things that involve some degree of risk. And paradoxically, the more you're successful, the less risk you're willing to undertake because you feel you're going to lose what you've got. And so I think a liberal arts education really does prepare you for anything, but most of all, you have to develop the self-confidence to be willing to take risks that you're not aware of now.
I want to ask about young people, Ken, and sort of direct this to you about the young people who work in your organization, maybe the people you're looking to hire. You know, we're talking about this liberal arts education, and to one degree or another, that means humanities, English, history, but science and technology becomes so important. You know, we keep talking about this over and over now. Has it really become the case, though, that you can't simply major in English or history and get a job at American Express, that you have to be a computer science major to succeed there?
No, I think what's important, the attributes that I look for is, one, I want people who are really good critical thinkers, conceptual, creative, have a passion for learning, have a passion for making a difference. And I just use one example that I talked about in our company. Jack Ma majored in English, in China, was an English teacher, didn't use a computer until he was 33 years old.
Founder of Alibaba.
And founder of Alibaba.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Sam Palmisano, chairman and CEO of IBM, majored in history at Johns Hopkins. So the reality is, A.G. Lafley, head of Procter & Gamble, went to Hamilton. So I've really found that people from small liberal arts colleges punch generally way above their weight. I haven't done the analysis, but I'm sure it would show that if you look at a variety of leadership levels in a range of professions, it makes a big difference. Now, what's important, and this goes back to the convergence of online and offline, is now in almost every discipline, you're involved in some way in digital. And so I think the fact that you are an English major is not a limiter at all. The question is your willingness to embrace the unknown. And the reality is, I didn't know much about digital until 20 years ago. I spend a lot of time, as you know, with startups all around the world. And one of the things that I've found is that clearly there are different pathways to success, and there are some people who certainly are great computer scientists, understand code, but I've also met people who have come from not only were English majors, but were art majors, and are playing pivotal roles in technology. So I think it's increasingly important in a liberal arts education that you have some exposure to technology. But the reality is that if you have a passion for learning, I don't see how in this day and age you have to, in fact, actively resist being involved in technology. You have to, and that's crazy. If you're doing that, then yes, you are a Luddite. You got problems. But the reality is that there's no way that you should avoid it, and you should run towards it.
But Shelley, you're at Johns Hopkins now, right?
I am.
Isn't all this talk maybe a little elitist? I mean, does this really apply to community colleges like Miami-Dade and vocational schools, or is there just a bigger and bigger divide in education between the Johns Hopkins and the Bowdoins and the Denisons, and then the schools that people are going to get jobs?
You know, I teach at Hopkins. It is a similar demographic, but I think it gets back to this point of what we were all trying to say of it's a critical thinking. And I don't think critical thinking is a commodity that we have a lock on in a certain arena of schools versus it's a way that we really have to think more on how do you incubate leadership skills? How do you incubate innovation, creativity? The liberal arts are a way to do that. And I think I had said earlier, I didn't know what liberal arts education was when I came to Bowdoin, but I had a revolutionary experience that kind of diversity and the way it challenged me to think. It's not exclusive to liberal arts, but I think it's the nature of the mix and match, the challenges you face, that can be absolutely integrated into every level of learning. That could be at kindergarten, that can be going through our high schools. I think we really have to foster, again, not the rote memory learning, which is something I came here thinking that's the cat's meow and that's why I'm smart. And I got good teaching that you're really not as smart as you think until you start being able to think. And that's something that we got to think about how to integrate at all levels of our education, not just what we call elitist schools.
Right. I mean, this
Could I just
go ahead, Senator. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to get out of the notion of thinking that these are mutually exclusive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There is no one path to success in life. Indeed, there is no one definition of success in life. And the key is having a system which permits the maximum opportunity for each person in our society, each of whom has something to contribute. And it is a state of mind that you have to encourage in people. For the vast majority of people in the community colleges, getting a good vocation and a good job can be a successful life. We don't have to measure it in terms of total amount of wealth, total amount of recognized achievements. It's the inner satisfaction. My parents had no education. My mother could not read or write. They died penniless. But they, in their minds, led very successful lives because each of their 5 children graduated from college and therefore would go on to lead lives that were far different and better than theirs. That's a definition of success. So, and many of these community college kids go on to other schools, and they reach a state of mind where they can achieve a level of accomplishment and genius. Genius knows no boundary, no ethnic group, no status. It can come from anywhere. Arguably, the 2 most recognizable entrepreneurs of our time are Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos. Steve Jobs' father was born in Syria. Jeff Bezos' adopted father was born in Cuba. Their success came from that spark of genius that was allowed to flourish in the free air of America. And that, I think, is what you have to do. Try to figure out to let each person go as high and as far as their talent will take them, achieving success on their own terms, not on some broadly defined social definition of success.
Amen to that. Having said that, we still need to, Clayton Rose needs to, and with the people who work with him, need to design a curriculum at Bowdoin and maintain the curriculum and change it. And there's a lot of question about how much of this, I wouldn't necessarily call it pre-professional and vocational, but it sort of speaks to that business skills should be a part of the curriculum. And this has been a timeless question, but it's more relevant now because of computer technology and beyond computer science. And Ruthie, you told me that Bowdoin helped you become entrepreneurial. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and if you think that it would be important to sort of overtly teach entrepreneurism at the college.
It's a great question. Courses in entrepreneurship would be fabulous. There's nothing wrong with that. I think, though, that what you're already teaching, what you're already getting, this broad variety of disciplines is the perfect foundation for a successful entrepreneur. I think, like what you said, Shelley, one of the things that profoundly affected me at Bowdoin was, trying new things, being forced to have multiple things going on, having the confidence to try things and problem solving, all of those skills is what led me to becoming an entrepreneur. But specific examples, even when I was at Bowdoin, for example, I did my junior year. I went to Boulder, Colorado for a semester, and got certified in aerobics instructing because I was an athlete and I missed the sports, and so I had to do something. And when I came back, I wanted to. They didn't have aerobics, so I went to the athletic department and said, I'd like to start an aerobics class. And basically, they said sure, and They paid me, and I started a program, and it was my first sort of entrepreneurial venture, if you will. And at 9 o'clock, after study halls, and people came, and it was a cross section. I would have like football players, and it was boys, girls, everybody. That kind of confidence. Just there was no aerobics. Create aerobics. When I went back 5 years later for my reunion. Girls are wearing sweatshirts, Bowdoin aerobics, like it became a thing. It went on for a while. This was the 80s. I don't think aerobics is big anymore, but it was new back then. But, that's just one example while I was here. But after Bowdoin, all my jobs, my corporate jobs and working with Ruthie Davis, I always looked at how to build a better mousetrap, how to make it better. I always, Bowdoin taught me to stand back and analyze and think about it. How do I put my unique stamp on it? And, just even silly things. Like when I was at Reebok, my first job was in the walking division, basically white walking shoes. And the business it was a huge division, actually. It was like, the top money maker. They didn't tell anybody because they wanted to be good in, basketball and running. But really it was the old lady walking shoes that were making the cash cow. But, they weren't selling in Europe very well. This is a huge company. I was like, a newbie. And I said I would go over and walk this 4-day walking event in Nijmegen, Holland, where I literally walked for 4 days. Again, Bowdoin, you do the sports, and you go to your classes, and you do your art, you do it all. So I was hands-on. I went over there, walked for 4 days, came back, wrote my little report, presented it to the mucky mucks, and basically, in summary, they don't walk in white shoes, they walk in brown shoes. So I launched this, off-road walking collection. Okay, that had never been done before. That's an example there. When I was at Uggs, they were selling sheepskin boots to the surfer dudes on the West Coast. They weren't selling on the East Coast where there was winter and cold and snow. Go figure. So they basically hired me to solve that problem. And, it wasn't rocket science. I didn't reinvent the wheel. It was a great product. But I said,
knows snow.
well, I did my research, the hands-on. And I said, number one, we need a luggier sole because the East Coasters think if their foot's going to get wet, it's a problem. If it's like too thin of a sole. And we need to expose the sheepskin on the outside of the boot to show the luxury. It was on the inside. It was like, put it on the outside.
You did that?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know.
Isn't that
That's
hard?
pretty cool. That deserves some applause too. Okay? I mean, you got some applause. She deserves it. Okay.
So yeah, plus I did product seeding. I did they never had a marketer before. So I put Uggs on celebrity. Pamela Sue Anderson wearing Uggs. But, and even with the Ruthie Davis brand, when I launched it, also in a liberal arts education, you do learn to tell stories. You analyze stories, literature. And really, as an entrepreneur and a brander, all I do all day long is tell my story, convince people to drink the Kool-Aid. I'm constantly trying to tell them how fabulous the shoes are, the brand story, et cetera. When I launched, people were like, oh, you're launching a shoe brand. That's so crazy. Why? They didn't get it. And, I told a story. I used to just say, in summary, well, imagine a Manolo Blahnik. Most of you know what a Manolo Blahnik is here? Raise your hand if you know what a Manolo Blahnik is. Okay, thank God. Okay, that's good news. Okay. A Manolo Blahnik and a Nike had a baby. What would it look like? Right here, people. So, that was my soundbite that I used to tell, the story. So, it's all of that. I mean, it's just thinking out of the box. All of that came from, being a great entrepreneur came from the liberal arts background. And I think, if they had classes in entrepreneurship would be great, but I think just the way it is now is perfectly great.
All right, Ken, I've got some, you're a public company CEO, you can handle this, because I got some questions from the Orient, and I'm going to give you, they wanted me to ask for people, so here we go. Okay. What advice would you give to Clayton Rose? Just that. They made me do this. I'm sorry, I'm a journalist too.
What I would say is, Clayton's a pretty sharp guy, and he actually asked me that 15 minutes before I came here. So what I said to Clayton is, and Clayton, I won't say everything because surprises are important, but what I do think is that it's critical for any new leader to figure out one or two areas where they're going to make their imprint. And I think early in your tenure, particularly when you're taking over a successful enterprise of any type, there's sometimes the tendency to be overly tentative and wait for 2 or 3 years before you make some change. And so I'm not saying that tomorrow Clayton's going to make transformational change because he's got to decide, but I think that Barry Mills did an unbelievable job. And part of succession is to make sure that you're taking the institution to the next level. So what are you going to do that is going to be innovative to move things forward? The second, which is the obvious one that I believe, is that when you're taking on a complex job, you really want to think through what are your 3 to 5 key priorities over the next 90 days and the next 24 months, and I'm confident Clayton's doing that.
Great. Thank you, and they thank you too. Senator, you get the call to solve these big problems. I remember having a conversation with you not long ago, and this really resonated with me. You told me when you were, I guess it was a majority leader, but when you were in the Senate in a leading role, that you had dinner with your counterpart, Bob Dole, once a week. behind the scenes, privately, to reach consensus. So now I'm giving you a problem, which is to solve what's going on in Washington right now. How would you do it?
Well, I did have dinner with Bob Dole, sometimes more than once a week, because when I was elected majority leader, the first person I called was him. And I went to see him. I told him that these are very tough jobs, leading the Senate. It would be very difficult if we had a good relationship, impossible if we didn't. So I said to him, I'm here to tell you how I intend to behave toward you, to ask you to behave in the same way toward me. And I set forth the most basic standards of fairness, decency, good dealing. He was delighted. We shook hands. To this moment, never once has a harsh word ever passed between Bob Dole and me in public or in private. We clashed every day on the Senate floor. We disagreed often. When we couldn't work it out among ourselves, the Senate decided. Sometimes my view prevails, sometimes his. But I think the key to our relationship was that we recognized that we had multiple obligations. We had an obligation to our parties. I was the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate, he the leader of the Republicans. Higher than that, we had an obligation to the institution of the Senate itself and to the Congress. And above all of that, we had an obligation to the people of this country. And as long as we were able to keep those priorities straight in our minds, we could work together and work things out. So that's missing now, and it's gotten dysfunctional. It's very common. I have a full speech on the subject, which I can't give here for time, so I'll just make 2 points. There are 2 changes I would make immediately if I had the authority to do so. First, to reduce the level of partisanship in redistricting of House congressional districts. Of the 435 seats in the House, only about 50 are competitive as between the parties. The rest are safe seats. The meaning of that is that it transfers the decisive moment in politics away from the general election to the nominating process. And as we all know, in the nominating process, a tiny handful of Americans participate, and they tend to be the most politically intense, rigid, ideological, unwillingness to compromise. So the members of Congress are responsive not to their general populations, but to a very small portion of it who are the most rigid and ideological. So you have to change that. The other one is you have to change the horrific, corrupting system of money in politics that is destroying our democracy. Let me ask you, you've got a very intelligent audience here. How many people here believe that members of Congress are more responsive to their constituents than they are to their donors? That's exactly the reaction I get all over America when I ask that question. In fact, only one woman has ever raised her hand, one person. It was a woman in Washington a year ago. After the session, it was a huge crowd. I went up to her, I said, I don't want to embarrass you, but I feel compelled to ask you. You're the only woman in America who's ever raised your hand. She said, it's very simple. My husband's a member of Congress. That was it. The Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case will go down in history as one of the worst decisions ever made by any Supreme Court in our history. We now have a spectacular increase in the amount of money, billions and billions and billions of dollars, accompanied by a dramatic decline in transparency. You don't know who's giving the millions because they're no longer required by law to report it. And in fact, candidates now, when they announce committees, state in the press release they will not disclose the names of the donors because they are not required to do so. So the combination of the two, corruption in the sense of saying, Senator Serwer, if you vote my way, I'll give you a bag full of cash, is very rare in our society. thankfully so. The real corruption came from the answer that you didn't give. The corruption is the American people have lost confidence in their elected officials and in the democratic process. And that is fatal to the effective functioning of democracy, as we're seeing now on display every day in Washington. Thank you.
Well, we're going to have to wrap things up. I guess that last point, we could throw that out as a challenge again to the students, the young people in the audience, as something that they can use their education to help address and fix in our society, because it certainly is a big challenge. And I don't think you mean to suggest that people shouldn't go into public service.
No, just the opposite.
what
They
you're
should
talking
go into it with the purpose and intention of fixing it.
Right, good. I like that. I actually just have one last question, and that is, Ruthie, what do you think of the senator's shoes? That's not good. That's not really. Okay.
They
You
were
like
good.
them?
I do, actually.
Okay,
They
good.
have a good shape. It's called the last. It's a good shape.
When I
Right
go
on.
home and tell my 14-year-old daughter that I sat with Ken Chenault and I helped inaugurate Clayton Rose, and by the way, I was on the same panel as Ruthie Davis, she's going to say, who's Ken who and who's Clayton who? But I know Ruthie.
Exactly. Thank you.
Well, it's really just an incredible group, and please join me in thanking Ken and Ruthie and Senator Michelle.